The old trapper's cabin roof caught fire at 3:17 a.m. Not lightning, not accident. Someone had climbed up there with kerosene and a match. A lone woman stood framed in the doorway, papers clutched hard against her chest like they were the only thing still breathing. Two shadows dropped from the eaves and melted into the black wall of spruce. She didn't scream, didn't run. She simply stepped forward into the rising flames, boots crunching, frost eyes fixed on the ridge above. On that ridge, a man caught the wrong smell riding the wind-sharp kerosene cutting through pine and snow. He started down the slope at a dead run. Whatever quiet life the mountain had held for 8 long years was already burning. Harlan Cade didn't sleep past 4. Never had. Probably never would. He was up before the light touched the ridge, before the frost had time to soften, before the birds remembered they existed. Coffee on the iron stove, boots laced tight, coat off the hook by the door, same order, every morning, for 8 years running. Some men called that lonely. Harlan called it clean. He stepped outside into the Montana dark and stood for a moment the way he always did. Just stood there, breathing, letting the cold settle into his lungs like it belonged there. 3,800 acres of timber and ridge and frozen creek bed stretched out around him in every direction. His land, his quiet, his alone. He wasn't a man who needed much, just this. The sky was doing its slow shift from black to deep blue when he started down the east trail. His boots knew every root, every soft patch, every place where the ground dropped without warning. He didn't need a lamp. He never did out here. The mountain had its own kind of visibility, not brightness exactly, but clarity, the kind that came from knowing a place so thoroughly that the dark stopped being an obstacle and started being just another part of the landscape. He was checking fence line, same as every first week of December, same as every year since he'd bought the eastern parcel and added it to the rest. 3 miles of fence running along the ridge above the Cottonwood Draw, marking the boundary between his land and the national forest. He walked it every winter before the snow got deep enough to make it impossible. Checked posts, checked wire, marked anything that needed attention come spring, the kind of work that didn't need thinking, which was exactly why he liked it. The trail east climbed gradually through a stand of lodgepole pine, then opened onto the ridge above the draw. From up here, even in December, even before full light, the land was something worth looking at. Long, rolling swells of terrain stretching north and south. The cottonwoods along the creek below stripped bare and gray. The granite shelf above the eastern timber stand catching the first pale reflection of the coming sun. Harlan walked it slowly, methodically. He checked the first post. Solid. Checked the wire between it and the next. Tight, no rust damage yet. The posts out here were treated Douglas fir set 4 feet deep. Good for another decade if the weather cooperated. He moved along the line, post by post, wire by wire. That was the thing about fence line work. You couldn't rush it. Rushing meant missing things, and missing things on a boundary line meant problems that didn't show themselves until they were expensive and complicated and involved people you didn't want on your property. He was 3/4 of a mile along the ridge when he smelled it. Wood smoke, not the wild kind, not a lightning strike, not a campfire from a passing hunter who didn't know better. This was different. Controlled, steady, the kind of smoke that rises from a stove with a proper damper, the kind that means someone knows what they're doing. Harlan stopped walking. His eyes moved to the draw below the ridge, to the stand of spruce and juniper that nobody bothered with because the terrain was wrong for logging and too exposed for camping, to the place where an old trapper's cabin had been sitting empty and falling apart since before he bought this parcel. He'd meant to tear that cabin down. 3 times he'd put it on the list. 3 times something more urgent had pushed it off. Winter maintenance on the equipment shed, a section of the north fence that needed complete replacement, a problem with the upper creek diversion that had taken 2 weeks to sort out. Now there was smoke coming out of its chimney. Thin, straight, unwavering. Somebody's home. He didn't rush. That wasn't his way. He stood on the ridge for a full 2 minutes watching the smoke rise and dissolve into the pale morning sky. Then he started down the slope. Slow, deliberate. The way a man moves when he wants to see before he's seen. The closer he got, the more he noticed. Fresh wood, stacked against the south wall of the cabin, split clean and ranked by size. Not thrown there, arranged. Somebody had spent real time on that stack, the pieces sorted by diameter, the largest at the bottom, the kindling at the top, the whole thing covered with a scrap of canvas to keep the snow off. New chinking in the gaps between the logs. The old moss and cloth had been cleaned out and replaced with something better. River clay, maybe mixed with dry grass. It was rough work, but it would hold against the wind. The porch, what was left of it, had 2 new boards across the worst section, rough cut, unfinished, but level. Solid. Someone had shimmied them carefully so they didn't rock. Harlan stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at all of it. This didn't happen overnight. Whoever was in that cabin had been working it for weeks, maybe longer. This wasn't a squatter throwing up shelter in a hurry. This was someone who had assessed the structure, prioritized the repairs, and executed them in the right order. He crossed the clearing, boots crunching over frost-stiffened grass. He raised his hand to knock on the door. The door opened first. She stood there like she'd been waiting for him, which Harlan realized later she probably had. Sound carries differently in cold air. She'd heard his boots on the frozen ground from 50 yards out and had stood behind that door listening to him approach and had chosen to open it rather than wait for the knock. That too was a choice, and choices told you things. She was tall for a woman. Dark hair pulled back not neatly, just out of the way, the same way you'd move something off a work surface to clear room for what mattered. She wore a canvas work coat that was too big in the shoulders. The sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the cold. In her left hand she held an adze, a woodworking tool, short-handled curved blade, the way someone holds a tool when they've been in the middle of using it and haven't decided yet whether to put it down. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kind of silence that wasn't awkward, just accessible. Then she said, "Morning," just that. Like it was the most natural thing, like she opened her door every day to find a large, silent man in a wool coat standing in her clearing. "Morning," Harlan said. Another pause. "This is my land," he said. "I know. You're living on it." "I am." He waited. Most people, when caught somewhere they weren't supposed to be, filled the silence immediately. Excuses, explanations, apologies stacked on top of each other like they were building something to hide behind. She didn't do that. She just looked at him. Calm. Level. The way you look at something you've already thought through a long time ago and don't need to think through again. "You want to come in?" she said. "Coffee's on." "Don't go in," some part of him said. "Going in means conversation. Conversation means complications. You don't need complications. You came out here to check fence line. Just tell her to be off your land by sundown and walk away." He went in. The inside of the cabin surprised him. Not because it was comfortable. It wasn't not by any standard worth using. The walls were still the same gray-weathered logs they'd always been. The floor still creaked under his weight. There was still a gap above the east window where the frame had shifted, and the light came through in a thin, cold line. But it was alive in a way it hadn't been for decades. A woven rug lay near the hearth, worn at the center, obviously carried from somewhere else. A rough table under the patched window, its legs shimmed level with flat stones because the floor wasn't. Herbs drying in bundles from the low rafters, sage, something else he couldn't name, a third thing that smelled faintly of pine resin. A single lantern hanging from a ceiling hook, casting steady amber light. Everything had a place. Everything was in it. She handed him a tin cup without asking how he took it. Black. Obviously. He looked at her over the rim. "How long?" he said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks and nobody told me." "Nobody knows," she said. That was the point. He drank the coffee. Looked around the room again. At the repaired window frame, the new chinking, the carefully stacked firewood beside the hearth. Then he looked back at her. "You did all this yourself?" Not a question. "I don't see anyone else here," she said. That tone. Not sarcastic, not sharp, just factual, like she was describing the state of the world and saw no reason to apologize for any part of it. Harlan set the cup down. "Your name," he said. "Delia Voss." "Harlan Cade." "I know who you are," she said. "Everyone between here and Millhaven knows who you are." He let that sit. His name traveled, he knew that. Not because he was famous or loud or sought attention, because he was the kind of man who didn't move quietly through a community not out of noise but out of weight. You knew Harlan Cade owned the mountain the way you knew a large thing was in a room even before you looked directly at it. "What brought you here, Delia Voss?" She didn't answer right away, picked up her coffee cup, took a slow drink, set it back down. "I needed somewhere nobody would look," she said finally, running from something, not the law. "Then what?" She looked at him steadily. "The kind of trouble the law doesn't bother with." He held her gaze. She didn't look away, didn't add anything, didn't try to soften it or explain it or dress it up in something easier to swallow. He respected that. People told truth in layers. The first layer was usually performance, what they wanted you to think. The second layer was defense, what they were protecting. The third layer, the real one, only came out when they decided you were worth the effort. She'd given him the third layer first. That was unusual. "I'll be plain," Harlan said. "Please. This is my land. You're on it without permission. That's a situation I have to address." "Tell me what you want," Delia said. "I'll abide by it." He looked at her for a long moment. Most people in her position begged, or lied, or made themselves small and pitiful and hoped that softened the outcome. She did none of those things. She just waited, like she was ready to receive whatever decision he made and deal with it accordingly. She's asking for terms, he thought, like a person who intends to keep them. Harlan walked to the window, looked out at the eastern slope through the patched glass. He had a problem he hadn't been able to solve. The eastern boundary of his property ran along a ridge that nobody could read without proper survey equipment and the knowledge to use it. His usual crew, good men, solid workers, refused to go up there in winter. Too exposed, too unpredictable. The terrain on that ridge was technical in the way that required both skill and the particular willingness to work in conditions that most sensible people avoided, and the boundary markers hadn't been checked in 3 years, which left him in a legally uncomfortable position. If anyone ever decided to push on those property lines from the National Forest side or from any other direction, he had no recent documentation to stand on. A 3-year gap in a property record wasn't catastrophic, but it was a gap, and gaps were where trouble liked to live. He needed someone who could read terrain, who could move in cold, who could document what they found and bring it back in a form he could use. He turned from the window, looked at this woman who had rebuilt a collapsing cabin in 6 weeks, alone, in November. She can read terrain, he thought. She can move in cold. Look at this place, everything she's done here is systematic. She prioritized correctly. She executed in the right order. That's not luck, that's method. "There's a section of fence line on my eastern boundary," he said. 3 miles, rough country. My crew won't work it in winter. Delia said nothing, listening. "I need it surveyed, boundary markers checked, photographed, documented, any encroachment recorded, written notes I can stand behind legally." "In exchange for what?" "You stay in this cabin through winter. Legal. Under a work contract. My name on the paperwork. If anyone asks why you're on my land, there's documentation, a defined purpose, a signature." Something shifted in her eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like recalculation. Like she'd run a set of numbers expecting one result and gotten another. "Your signature carries weight," she said. "Around here, yes." Delia set down the ads she'd been holding this whole time. First time she'd let go of it since she'd opened the door. Harlan noticed that. "And at the end of winter," she said, "contract ends, no obligation on either side. I want that in writing. I'll write it now." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. A pencil. The kind of notebook he used for boundary notes and timber counts. Nothing fancy, just gritted paper with a brown cover worn soft at the corners from years in his pocket. He wrote the terms in his own handwriting. Clear, precise, no flourishes. Delia Voss. Winter work contract. Eastern boundary survey. Duration first snowmelt or March 15th, whichever comes first. Compensation use of cabin on Cade property. Contract terminates without obligation to either party upon completion of agreed term. He handed it to her. She read it. Not quickly, carefully, every word. "One change," she said. Harlan blinked. People didn't usually edit his terms. "Add a clause," she said, "that I can end the contract early if circumstances require with 2 weeks' notice without penalty." "You planning on leaving?" "I'm planning on having options." He took the notebook back. added the clause. His handwriting was angular compact, exactly as precise as it needed to be, and not one mark more. He handed it back. She read it again, the whole thing, not just the new clause. "This is fair," she said quietly. "It's meant to be." She reached for the pencil. She signed her name in handwriting that was neat and controlled, unhurried, not the signature of someone desperate, the signature of someone who meant it. Delia Marjorie Voss. Harlan added his below hers, bold, without hesitation. "You keep that," Delia said, handing back the notebook. "You don't want a copy." "I'll honor what I signed," she said. "I don't need paper to remind me." Harlan folded the notebook and slipped it back into his coat. He picked up his coffee cup, finished what was left, set it on the table. "Eastern boundary starts at the spruce break above the creek," he said. "You'll need a compass and a camera." "I have both." Of course she did. "I'll check your notes at week's end," he said. She nodded. "Understood." He walked to the door, put his hand on the frame, paused. "How'd you fix the roof?" he said. "Without a ladder long enough." A pause. "I made one," she said. He walked out into the cold. The first week Harlan kept his distance. That was deliberate. He wasn't the kind of man who hovered. He'd made an agreement Delia was keeping her end of it, and standing over her shoulder would have insulted them both. He heard her sometimes in the early morning when the wind was right, the sound of an axe. Clean, even strikes. No hesitation between swings. The rhythm of someone who had been splitting wood long enough that the motion was automatic, weight shift, drop, follow through. Not thinking about it, just doing it. He saw the smoke from the cabin chimney every morning when he came out to start his day. Steady, controlled, banked right. He thought about her more than he intended to, not in a complicated way. In the same way he thought about a good piece of timber, noticing the grain, the weight, the quality of it without needing to do anything about the noticing. There was something precise about Delia Voss that he hadn't expected. She didn't waste motion. She didn't waste words. He respected that in a person more than almost anything else. At the end of the week she came to his door. 7:15 in the morning. He'd been up since 4. She stood on his porch with a folder of notes in one hand and her boots still carrying trail mud from the ridge. She hadn't cleaned them before coming, which meant she'd come directly from work from the ridge itself without stopping at the cabin first. She handed him the folder without ceremony. "Eastern Boundary Survey," she said. "Full documentation. Photographs are described in the notes. Since I can't print them here, I'll need to take the film to Millhaven." "I have a way to develop film," he said. "There's a setup in the supply shed." Something shifted in her expression. "Of course there is." He almost smiled. Almost. He opened the folder. The notes were meticulous. Each boundary marker cataloged with a reference number, compass, bearing, and a description of its condition. Photographs numbered to match. Any deviation from the original survey map, which she had somehow obtained a copy of, he noticed and had annotated by hand in a different colored pencil, was marked clearly with the degree of difference and an estimated date of disturbance based on weathering and oxidation patterns. She hadn't just checked the fence line. She had built a legal record. Harlan read through the whole thing standing on his porch in the cold. Then he turned to the last page and stopped. "Wait." He read it again. Read it again. The eastern boundary. The section that ran along the top of the granite ridge above the cottonwood draw. 4 markers in a quarter-mile stretch. All 4 had been moved, not fallen. Not shifted by frost heave or tree roots or any of the natural forces that push things around over time. Moved, deliberately, systematically. Each one repositioned precisely 18 inches further west, further onto his property, with the disturbed earth around the base refilled and compressed to conceal the evidence of the repositioning. Recent disturbance. She'd noted the oxidation on the exposed soil, the lack of frost penetration at the base. She estimated the repositioning had happened sometime in the last 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days. Harlan stood very still. Someone had walked onto his land. In the dark, probably, or in the early morning when no one would be around to see, and they had moved 4 boundary markers, not randomly, not carelessly, but precisely in a way that would shift his legal property line nearly 20 feet in that section. 20 feet didn't sound like much. But 20 feet along a quarter-mile of ridgeline combined with the right legal filing at the right office could change the ownership of the timber on that slope. Timber worth a great deal of money to the right buyer. He looked up from the folder. Delia was watching him. Her expression hadn't changed. She'd already read what she'd written. She already knew what she'd found. "You knew what this was," he said. "I suspected," she said. "When I found the first one, I thought it might be frost shift. By the fourth one, I stopped thinking that." "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because I wanted this full documentation before I said anything, so you'd have something solid to stand on, not just my word." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She found this in 1 week. 1 week of walking his fence line in December. His crew had been on this property for 8 years and hadn't seen it. "Who did the original survey on this parcel?" she asked. "Territorial Office, 1987. Has it been resurveyed since?" "No." She nodded slowly. "Then whoever did this was counting on the fact that the original markers were the only reference point. If you don't have anyone checking them regularly, nobody would notice. Not for years," she said, "by which time any legal challenge would be considerably harder." Harlan closed the folder. He stood on his porch in the December cold and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. Someone is trying to take my land. And they'd been doing it quietly, patiently, the way someone does it when they're very good at what they do and very confident that no one is paying close enough attention to stop them. He handed the folder back to Delia. "Keep this," he said. "Safe, not in the cabin." She took it without asking why. She understood why. "The western section," he said. "I haven't surveyed west yet. Start tomorrow." "Understood." She turned to go. "Delia." She stopped. He looked at her straight. "You did good work." She didn't smile, didn't deflect, didn't say, "Oh, it was nothing," the way some people did when they were uncomfortable with direct acknowledgement. She just said, "I know," and walked back toward the Eastern Trail. That night, Harlan sat at his kitchen table with a topographic map spread out in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He'd been staring at the same section for 40 minutes. The eastern ridge, the cottonwood draw, the timber stand below the granite shelf that he'd been letting grow undisturbed for 6 years. Ponderosa pine, mostly. Some Douglas fir mixed in at the lower elevations. A significant stand, not old growth, but close enough to old growth to matter. 6 years of careful stewardship. 6 years of leaving it alone when it would have been easier and more immediately profitable to cut it. He'd left it because some things were worth more standing. He'd made that decision early in the second year of ownership when a timber buyer from Kalispell had driven up the mountain unannounced and offered him a number that had taken a moment to process because it was larger than he'd expected. The man had been friendly, professional. The offer was legitimate and the price was fair. Harlan had thanked him and said no. The buyer had looked at him the way people look at someone who has just declined a reasonable gift, as if the refusal itself required explanation. Harlan didn't offer one. He just waited until the man got back in his truck and drove away. Then he walked up to the eastern slope and stood in the timber for a while in the particular quiet that exists inside a stand of old trees, and he thought about what the buyer had seen when he looked at that slope. He'd seen board feet. He'd seen dollars per thousand. He'd seen the clean efficiency of converting standing wood into usable material and usable material into money. What Harlan saw was different. He saw the way the ponderosa grew in that specific drainage, the particular spacing they'd found over decades, the way the root systems had networked through the soil, the understory of ferns and low shrubs that the canopy had made possible. He saw water retention. He saw a wildlife corridor. He saw the particular quality of silence that only exists in places that have been left alone long enough. He'd left it because some things were worth more standing. Now someone was trying to take it. He pressed his thumb against the map where the markers had been, thought about the precision of it, the patience. Whoever had repositioned those markers had done it with care, with the right equipment in conditions that required real knowledge of this kind of terrain. This wasn't random opportunism. This was planned. Someone had studied this property, had identified the most valuable section, had researched the legal mechanism for claiming it, and had then executed a careful multi-step strategy involving physical trespass, the repositioning of survey markers, and the filing of paperwork through a company structure designed to survive challenge. All of it planned before Delia Voss had ever appeared on his land. All of it already in motion before he'd smelled smoke from that cabin chimney. Who? He didn't have an answer yet, but he was going to get one. That was the thing about men like Harlan Cade. They didn't make noise when they started moving toward something. They just started moving. The second week, Delia brought him the Western Survey. No encroachment on the west. Markers intact. Fence in better condition than the east, probably because the western terrain was flatter and more visible from the road, harder to work on without being seen. It's targeted, Harlan said, looking at her notes. Just the eastern ridge. Which is consistent with someone who knows the value of that timber stand, Delia said. The western section is open pasture. The east is where the money is. He looked at her. You know timber values. My husband did, she said. I learned by proximity. Said it simply. Without pain. Without that particular flatness that meant someone was working hard to conceal pain. Just information offered in the spirit of explanation. He filed it away. Your husband, he said. When did he pass? 14 months ago. I'm sorry. So am I, she said, and meant it, and didn't say anything else about it. Harlan had spent 8 years on this mountain watching people make grief into a performance, wearing it visibly so others would know to treat them gently, adjusting their behavior in response to yours. Delia wore hers the way you wear a scar. It was there. It was real. It didn't need announcing because it was simply part of the landscape of her now, and she'd learned to move through that landscape the same way she moved through everything else. Without complaint. With direction. He respected that more than he knew how to say. What happened after? He said. After he died. She was quiet for a moment. Things moved fast, she said. The kind of fast that happens when someone knows you're alone and not sure where you stand legally. Someone moved on your property. Not a question. He'd already started putting it together. A man named Silas Greer, she said. He called himself a land broker. Said he was there to help settle my husband's estate. Said there were outstanding debts I wasn't aware of. She paused. There weren't. But he had paperwork. He had paperwork that looked official, with my signature on it. Another pause, shorter. A signature I didn't put there. Harlan's jaw tightened. He knew that move. He'd seen it once years back in a dispute he'd been asked to consult on as a surveyor. A broker working a widowed farmer on the eastern plains. Same method. Manufactured debt. Official-looking documents. Forged signatures on transfer agreements. By the time the farmer understood what had happened, the land had been legally transferred and sold to a third party, and the chain of ownership was clean enough that reversing it would require a legal fight the man couldn't afford. The sheriff, Harlan said the papers looked legitimate. Her voice was level. Said I must have signed something I didn't remember. Said these things happen when people are grieving. You were certain you hadn't signed. I'd have remembered signing away my land, she said. There was something in the way she said it. Not loud, not angry, just absolute. The tone of someone stating a fact so obvious it barely needed stating. I'd have remembered. Harlan believed her. What did you do? I tried to fight, she said. Without a lawyer, without money for a lawyer, without anyone willing to stand up and say what they'd seen. She looked at the map on his table. Then one morning I came out and Wade Denny, one of Greer's men, was standing on my land with a group of workers starting to tear down my fence. He had documents, signed documents. The transfer was complete. You left. I left, she said. Not because I gave up. Because standing there arguing with Wade Denny while he had paperwork and I had nothing wasn't fighting. It was losing in front of an audience. Harlan looked at this woman standing in his kitchen, 14 months out from losing her husband, weeks out from losing her land, living in a patched-up cabin in his timber with her tools and her survey notes and her absolute refusal to be diminished by any of it. He thought about the moved boundary markers on his eastern ridge. He thought about Silas Greer. And he thought, these two things are not separate. Greer, he said. Does he work this region? He moves around, Delia said. But he was working out of Mill Haven when he came to me. Had an office on the main street for 3 months. Millhaven, 20 miles south, the nearest town with a county recorder's office. The same recorder's office where any legal filing affecting his eastern boundary would need to be registered. 60 to 90 days ago. Harlan folded the map. "Thank you for the survey," he said. She looked at him, reading him the way she'd read the terrain. "You already know something," she said. He met her eyes. "I'm starting to." She didn't push, didn't ask him to explain himself. She picked up her folder and her coat and walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped. "Harlan," he looked up. "Whatever you're thinking," she said, "be careful about being the only one who knows it." She walked out. He stood at his table and looked at the closed door for a long moment. Be careful about being the only one who knows it. Because if something happened to him, if Greer or whoever was moving those markers decided that the man on the mountain was getting too close, all of this disappeared. The survey notes, the documentation, the connection between Delia's situation and his own. Gone. Harlan walked to the shelf above his desk, took down a second notebook, older, thicker, its pages stiff with age and use. He opened it to the first blank page. And he started writing. Everything. In order. Every marker. Every measurement. Every calculation. Everything Delia had told him about Greer. Every date he could pin down. He wrote for 2 hours. Then he sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to Commissioner Roy Aldis at the Montana Land Office in Helena, and set it on his desk. Not mailed, not yet, but ready. He blew out the lamp, went to bed, lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the spruce trees on the ridge. Tomorrow he was going to drive into Millhaven. Not to make noise, not to make accusations, just to look. Because before you move against something, you understand it. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. He pulled up to the county recorder's office at 8 in the morning. Gray sky. Cold that had teeth. The main street of Millhaven half alive, a few trucks parked outside the hardware store, a light on in the diner, the barbershop sign still dark. The recorder was a thin man named Kessler, who'd been in that office since before Harlan had bought his first parcel. They had a working relationship. Not warm, functional. The kind of relationship built on mutual efficiency rather than personal affection, which suited Harlan fine. "Cade," Kessler said, looking up from a stack of folders. "What brings you in? Need to look at recent filings, eastern boundary of my property, anything touching the ridge parcel." Kessler's expression didn't change. Recent meaning, last 90 days. The man pulled a ledger, ran his finger down a column, turned to the next page, and the next. His finger stopped. He turned the ledger to face Harlan without a word. Harlan looked at the entry. Boundary adjustment filing, Eastern Timber Ridge parcel. Filed by Wade Denny, representing Greer Land Holdings, LLC. Date of filing October 14th. October 14th, 73 days ago. Right in the middle of Delia's 60 to 90-day window. The filing described a correction to the original 1987 survey, citing erosion-related displacement of original markers and proposing a revised boundary line that Harlan could calculate it in his head, had been calculating it since he'd read Delia's survey notes, would transfer approximately 11 acres of his Eastern Timber Ridge to Greer Land Holdings. 11 acres. The 11 acres with the ponderosa pine. Worth at current timber prices considerably more than most people in this county made in several years. Harlan kept his face completely still. He was very good at that. "Has this been processed?" he said. "It's in review," Kessler said. "Commissioner's office has to sign off on boundary adjustments of this size. We sent it up to Helena 6 weeks ago." Helena. Commissioner Roy Aldis. Harlan thanked Kessler and walked back to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a moment. Greer Land Holdings. Not Silas Greer personally. A company, which meant lawyers, which meant the filing would be structured to survive challenge, which meant someone had spent real money setting this up properly over real time. This isn't a small operation. He started the truck, drove back up the mountain. He needed to talk to Delia Voss, not because he owed her an explanation, but because whatever Silas Greer was building piece by piece, filing by filing, forged signature by forged signature, it had touched both of them. And 2 sets of information were always better than 1. He pulled up to the cabin in the mid-afternoon. She was outside splitting wood, every swing clean, every split exact, no wasted motion. She set the axe down when she heard his truck, waited. He walked up to her and said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him steadily. "I found the filing," he said. "Greer is trying to take 11 acres of my eastern ridge through a boundary correction claim. Filed 73 days ago." He paused. "The same section where someone moved my markers." Delia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He's done this before." "I know. He'll have someone inside," she said. "Someone in the system who approves things that shouldn't be approved." "I know that too." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd looked at those boundary markers, searching for the truth of the thing, not the surface of it. "What are you going to do?" she said. Harlan looked at the eastern ridge above the tree line, at the timber stand he'd spent 6 years letting grow, at the land that had been his for 8 years and that some careful, patient, well-funded operation was trying to take from him. "I'm going to stop it," he said. "Simple as that. No drama, no speech, just a fact." Delia picked up her axe. "Then you'd better start soon," she said, "because men like Greer don't stop moving just because someone noticed." She split the next log clean down the middle, and Harlan Cade walked back to his truck thinking that the most useful thing that had happened to him in 8 years of living alone on this mountain was a woman who'd turned up uninvited in a broken-down cabin and had better eyes than anyone he'd ever hired. Harlan drove into Millhaven the next morning before the town was fully awake. That was intentional. He wanted to see Silas Greer before Greer had time to prepare a face. The drive down took 40 minutes on a good day. This wasn't a good day. The road had iced overnight and his truck moved slower than he liked, which gave him more time for thinking than he'd asked for. He thought about the filing. 11 acres, 73 days ago. Filed quietly through a company with a clean name and a legal structure that would take time to unpick. He thought about Delia. 14 months a widow. Lost her land to the same man. Same method. Different target. He thought about the markers. 18 inches each. 4 of them. Repositioned carefully by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. He found Greer outside the feed store on the main street. Tall man, narrow through the shoulders. Dressed better than the town required a good coat. Clean boots, the kind of hat that said, "I have money," without announcing it. He was talking to 2 men whose coats were clean in the wrong way. Not work clean. Deliberately clean. The kind of men who stood near work without doing any of it. Greer saw Harlan coming from half a block away. Didn't run. Didn't flinch. Just watched him approach with the particular stillness of a man who'd been approached before by angry men and had survived all of them. Harlan stopped 3 feet away. "Silas Greer," he said. "Harlan Cade." Greer smiled, a careful smile, the kind engineered to look easy. "Man on the mountain, I've heard about you. You filed a boundary correction on my eastern ridge." "My company did. A legitimate filing, based on documented erosion displacement of the original 1987 survey markers. All proper." "The markers were moved," Harlan said. "By hand, recently." Greer tilted his head slightly. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a documented fact." "Documented by whom?" Harlan didn't answer that, because he wasn't giving Greer anything he didn't have to. Not yet. Greer studied him. The smile didn't change, but something behind it did a small recalculation. The look of a man who'd expected anger and gotten something quieter and was deciding what that meant. "Mr. Cade," Greer said, "the process exists for a reason. If you believe there's an error in the survey data, you're welcome to contest it through the proper channels." "I intend to," Harlan said. "Good. Then the process will sort it out." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. At the careful suit, the careful smile. The 2 men standing slightly behind who weren't part of the conversation but were very much part of the conversation. "You were in Millhaven 3 months ago," Harlan said. "Working another claim." Greer nodded pleasantly. "I work several claims." "A woman named Delia Voss." Something moved across Greer's face. Fast, gone in under a second. Not guilt, not fear. Recognition. And behind it, calculation. The look of a man who'd just heard a name and was immediately working out what it meant that Harlan Cade was saying it. "I'm not familiar with..." "Don't." Harlan said quietly. One word. Greer stopped. The smile didn't fall, but it went still, like a mask that someone had stopped moving from behind. Be careful, Mr. Cade, Greer said softly. Accusations without evidence have a way of coming back around. Harlan looked at him one more time, taking stock. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. He didn't look back, because he already had what he'd come for. He'd come to see Greer's face when he heard Delia's name, and he'd seen it. He was halfway up the mountain when his phone rang. He pulled over, answered. It was Kessler at the recorder's office. The man's voice was different, flat in a way it hadn't been that morning. Cade, got a call after you left, from Sheriff Pruitt's office. Harlan waited. There's a complaint filed against you, Kessler said, allowing unauthorized occupation of your property resulting in a boundary dispute. Pruitt's office is opening an inquiry. Harlan sat with that for a moment. An inquiry. He'd been in Millhaven for 40 minutes. Who filed the complaint? A pause. Greerland Holdings, Kessler said. Harlan thanked him, hung up, sat in his truck on the icy mountain road and looked at the pine trees. 40 minutes. That was how long it had taken Greer to go from standing on the main street to having a complaint filed with the sheriff's office, which meant Greer had that complaint ready before Harlan arrived, had it prepared and waiting, had known or suspected that Harlan was going to come to town eventually and had the countermove already in a drawer somewhere. He's been watching this mountain, not just the land, Harlan himself. He started the truck, drove the rest of the way up the mountain thinking about what Pruitt's involvement meant. An inquiry meant Pruitt had accepted Greer's version as credible enough to investigate, which meant either Pruitt believed Greer or Pruitt had a reason to believe Greer that had nothing to do with the evidence. He went to see the sheriff the next morning. Cobb Pruitt had been in that office for 11 years. A solid man, not brilliant, not corrupt, Harlan had always thought, just solid. The kind of sheriff who kept the peace in a small county by not making enemies and not asking questions he didn't want answered. Harlan had respected that once. He was reconsidering. Pruitt's office smelled like old coffee and gun oil, maps on the wall. A deputy Harlan didn't recognize sitting at a desk near the door. Pruitt stood up when Harlan came in, extended his hand, shook it. Harlan, figured you'd come by. The complaint, Harlan said. Yeah. Pruitt sat back down. Look, I have to take it seriously when a formal complaint comes in. My hands are tied. Your hands are not tied, Harlan said. You chose to open an inquiry. Pruitt's eyes shifted slightly. It's procedure. Pruitt. Harlan leaned forward slightly. Not threatening, just direct. Greerland Holdings filed a boundary correction on my property based on markers that were physically moved onto my land. That's the complaint that should be sitting on your desk. I understand your position. My position is that someone trespassed on my property, moved my boundary markers, filed fraudulent paperwork with the recorder's office, and is now using your office to slow down my response to it. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk, at his hands, not at Harlan. And Harlan understood, not in a flash, not dramatically, just clearly, the way you understand the weather when you've been watching it long enough. Pruitt already knew. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. He'd known about Greer's filing before Harlan walked in. He'd accepted the complaint without asking the questions he should have asked. And right now he was looking at his hands because he couldn't look at Harlan Cade and say what he was about to say while meeting his eyes. I'll look into both situations, Pruitt said carefully. But in the meantime, I'd advise you not to take any action that could be construed as interfering with what Harlan said. Pruitt said nothing. Harlan stood up. How long has he had you? Harlan said quietly. Pruitt's jaw tightened. That's not an accusation, Harlan said. A question. Silence. Long enough to be its own answer. Harlan walked out. He drove back up the mountain and sat in his truck thinking about Pruitt. Not with anger. With something more complicated than anger. Pruitt wasn't a villain the way Greer was a villain. He was a tired man who'd been offered small accommodations over a long period of time until the accommodations stopped feeling like accommodations and started feeling like just the way things worked. A filing approved here. A complaint accepted there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that felt in any individual moment like a decision to do something wrong. just friction removal. For a man like Greer, who worked in paperwork and patience, having the local sheriff as a source of friction removal was worth more than money. It was infrastructure. Human infrastructure. A network of people in the right offices in the right positions who would move things along without asking too many questions. Not because they were evil, because they were tired or indebted, or because the accommodations had come gradually enough that the line between appropriate and inappropriate had blurred into something they'd stopped being able to see clearly. Pruitt had probably told himself 100 different stories, that the filings were legitimate anyway, that Greer was just a businessman doing what businessmen do, that the people losing land had made choices he couldn't be responsible for, stories that let a man look at himself in the mirror each morning, until the morning he couldn't anymore. That morning was coming, one way or another. Harlan got out of the truck, walked to the cabin, stood in his kitchen. What do I have? Survey documentation from Delia. Solid, detailed, legally sound. Knowledge of the filing, the date, the company name. A direct confrontation with Greer in which Greer had reacted to Delia's name before he could stop himself. And now Pruitt. What don't I have? A path to challenge the filing that doesn't go through Pruitt's office. Evidence of the forged signature on Delia's transfer. Anyone above Pruitt's level who knows what's happening. He put a pot of coffee on, sat down at the table, opened the old notebook, and started mapping it out. Not angrily, methodically, because that was the only way to do something like this right. He walked to the cabin that evening. Delia was inside, a small fire going. She was working at the table by the window, head bent over something, a pencil moving steadily. He knocked. "It's open," she said. He came in. She looked up, took in his face. Didn't ask how it went. Just waited. "Pruitt's working with Greer," he said. She set the pencil down. "How long?" "Long enough that it's not new." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "He was the one who told me my signature was probably legitimate," she said, "when I reported it. He was the one who said I must have signed something I'd forgotten." A pause. "He looked me in the eye when he said it." Harlan sat down across from her. "We can't go through Pruitt," he said. "No. We need to go above him. Montana Land Office. Helena." She looked up. "Commissioner Aldis." "You know the name." "I looked up who has jurisdiction over disputed boundary filings," she said, "when I was still trying to fight for my own land, before I ran out of money and options." "I know Aldis," Harlan said. "I worked a contract survey for the Territorial Office 8 years ago. He was the one who signed off on my work." "Do you trust him?" "I trust that he's not Pruitt," Harlan said, "which right now is a significant qualification." She almost smiled. Almost. "To go to Helena," she said, "we need more than what we have. The survey documentation is solid, but it's my word against their filing on the markers. And on my land," she paused, "it's my word against a signed document. A forged document. Which looks like a signed document to anyone who doesn't know my handwriting." Harlan looked at her. "Do you have anything from your husband letters notes? Anything with your signature that establishes what your real handwriting looks like?" Delia was quiet. He could see it, a door opening behind her eyes. "His letters," she said slowly. "He wrote me letters, even when we lived in the same house, a habit he had." She stopped. "I packed everything when I left. I took what fit in the truck." "Is it here?" "Some of it." She stood, went to the corner of the cabin where a canvas bag sat against the wall, began going through it carefully. Harlan watched her hands, methodical, each item checked and set aside. She pulled out a battered leather satchel, opened it, reached in. Her hand stopped. She went very still. "Delia." She pulled something out, a small envelope, cream-colored, sealed, and then opened the flap, bent back. She turned it over in her hands slowly. "I didn't know this was in here," she said quietly. "I've never seen this envelope before." She opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, densely written on both sides in a hand she clearly recognized, and beneath it, a second sheet. Smaller, official-looking. She read. Harlan waited. Her face changed while she read. Not dramatically, not with tears or gasps. It changed the way landscape changes at first light slowly and then all at once, until everything looked different. She looked up. "My husband knew," she said. Her voice was very steady, the way voices get when a person is holding something large inside them and choosing deliberately, consciously not to let it move. "He knew about Greer," she said. "He'd been approached 6 months before he got sick. Greer tried to buy our land. My husband refused. Greer came back 3 more times. Each time my husband said no." She looked at the letter. "He wrote this. He wrote that he was keeping a copy of our original deed and the original survey registration somewhere I would find it if something happened." She held up the second sheet. "This is it, the original registration, notarized, with both our signatures." Silence in the cabin. "Your husband put it in your bag," he said, "without telling me." Her voice caught on the last word, just slightly, just once. "Because he knew if he told me I'd ask why. And he didn't want me to worry." She set the papers down on the table, looked at them. "He prepared for something he hoped would never happen," she said. "And then it happened. And he wasn't there to use what he'd prepared." Harlan said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be better than silence. After a moment, she pressed her hands flat on the table, took a breath. "This is the proof," she said. "The original registration has my signature. It won't match what Greer filed. A handwriting comparison would show it immediately. Combined with the survey documentation on my eastern ridge, it establishes a pattern," she said. "Same broker, same method, different targets." "We have enough to go to Aldous," he said. "Almost. We have enough to make a case. We don't have enough to guarantee he listens." "I'll make him listen." She looked at him, measuring. "You're very certain of yourself," she said. "I'm certain of the documentation," he said, "which is the same thing." This time she did smile. Small, brief, like a light switched on and off. "When do we go?" she said. 2 days, he said. "I need to prepare a full file first. Every piece of documentation organized. Survey notes, the filing, your registration, the letter, a timeline of events. I want Aldous to be able to see the whole picture in one sitting." "I can help with that." "I know." They worked for 2 days. Not together exactly. Side by side. Harlan at his kitchen table, Delia at the cabin passing documents back and forth in the late afternoons. He organized the legal structure. She cross-referenced dates and established the connection between Greer's activities on her land and the subsequent filing on Harlan's. It was the kind of work that had no drama in it, just focus, just the particular quiet of 2 people who were good at things sitting near each other and being good at things. Harlan noticed, without intending to notice, that she made coffee the same way he did, strong enough to hold a spoon upright. No commentary about it, no asking if it was too strong. It was what it was. He noticed that she worked until the light was gone and stopped exactly when it was gone. Not before, not after. He noticed that when she handed him documents, she always made sure they were facing him correctly so he could read them without turning them around. A small thing. The kind of thing you don't do by accident. You do it because you've been thinking about the other person's ease without drawing attention to the thinking. On the second evening, she set down the last of the files on his kitchen table. "I think that's everything," she said. He looked through the whole stack, every page. "It's good," he said. "It's thorough," she said, which isn't the same thing. Thorough doesn't mean Aldous will act on it. No, but it means he can't pretend he doesn't have information. She pulled on her coat, moved toward the door. "Delia." She stopped. "You don't have to come," he said. "I can present the case without—" "I know you can," she said, "but it's my land too, my husband's letter, my evidence." A pause. "And I'm done sending other people to fight for things that are mine." She walked out. He looked at the closed door for a moment, then went back to the table and read through the whole file one more time. Because you check your work, even when it's right, especially when it matters. He woke at 3 in the morning to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, not the controlled, banked smell of a stove. Something sharper, something wrong. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before he was fully awake. Coat off the hook, door open. He could see it from his porch, the cabin. Not engulfed, not burning fully, but a section of the roof, the section Delia had patched with new boards in November, was alight. orange against the black sky, and someone was running along the tree line. 2 figures, moving fast, away from the cabin and into the dark beyond the spruce. Harlan ran. He covered the distance in under 3 minutes. The roof section was burning slowly. The green timber she'd used to patch it wasn't dry enough to catch fast, which was the only reason it wasn't worse. He grabbed the water barrel she kept by the door, threw it up, twice, 3 times. By the time the last ember was out, he was soaked and breathing hard. He pushed the door open. Delia, she was already up, standing in the middle of the cabin in her coat and boots, holding the files against her chest, all of them. She'd grabbed them first, before anything else. She looked at him, at his wet coat, at the steam rising from his sleeves in the cold air. "I heard them on the roof," she said. "I had enough time." He looked at her, at the files pressed against her chest. He looked around the cabin, smoke damage near the ceiling, everything else untouched. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." "The files. I have them." He exhaled. He looked at the hole in the ceiling where the roof had burned through, a circle of black sky, cold air pouring in, a few flakes of snow drifting down through the opening, landing on the floor and melting almost immediately. "You can't stay here tonight," he said. "I know. You can sleep in my spare room." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them made it into anything it wasn't. "All right," she said. She gathered what she needed in 4 minutes, which was approximately 4 minutes less than it would take most people. They walked back to his cabin through the dark. She went straight to the spare room. He went straight to the kitchen table to write down a description of the 2 figures he'd seen at the tree line. Height, build, direction of travel, time, because you write things down. Even at 3 in the morning. Even when your hands are still cold from the water barrel. Especially then. He drove to Millhaven the next morning. Not to see Greer. Not to see Pruitt. To the phone at the general store. He called the county fire marshal's office. Reported the incident. Described the figures. Requested an investigation. He called a lawyer in Billings he'd used twice on property disputes. Left a message outlining the situation and asking for advice on emergency protective orders. He called the recorder's office, asked Kessler if the boundary correction filing had progressed to final review. "It's been escalated," Kessler said, voice flat. "Pruitt's office submitted a supporting statement yesterday." Yesterday. While Harlan and Delia had been preparing their file. While someone had been climbing onto the cabin roof with an accelerant. Not coincidence. Harlan hung up, stood by the phone for a moment. They know about the file. Maybe not the specifics, but enough. Greer knew Harlan was building a challenge, and he'd decided the fastest solution was to reduce the documentation to ash. He didn't count on her grabbing it first. He drove back up the mountain. Delia was in his kitchen when he got there. She'd made coffee. She'd also repaired the spare room's window latch, which had been loose for 2 years. He looked at the latch. "The latch was loose," she said before he could say anything. He poured himself coffee. "Pruitt submitted a supporting statement to the filing," he said. "Yesterday." Her jaw tightened. "While we were preparing," she said. "Yes, and the fire the same night." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Quiet, running the sequence, calculating the coordination required. "Someone told Greer we were building a case," she said. "Someone with access to Pruitt," he said. "Or the recorder's office, or both." Harlan. "Yeah. We need to go to Helena tomorrow," she said. "Not the day after. Tomorrow. Because if we wait, something else happens. Something worse." He looked at her. She was right. He'd been thinking 2 more days of preparation. A stronger file. But you couldn't out-prepare a man who was watching you prepare. "Tomorrow," he said. 5 in the morning. She nodded. Then she looked out the window at the eastern ridge. "He thought burning the cabin would stop us," she said. Harlan drank his coffee. "He doesn't understand what he's dealing with," he said. "No," she said, "he doesn't." They left at 5. Dark still. Cold that had weight to it. The file was in a waterproof case in the back seat. Delia had her husband's letter in her inside coat pocket, close to her body, the way you carry something that matters. 3 hours to Helena. Mountain roads first, then highway, then the city appearing out of the gray morning like something half-remembered. Harlan drove. Delia looked out the window. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. What if Aldous has already processed the filing? What if they were 3 hours too late? What if Greer, with his speed and his system and his county sheriff writing supporting statements, had already closed the door? Harlan didn't say it, because saying it wouldn't change it, and they were going regardless. So he drove. The mountain road unrolled in front of them in the cold gray light, and somewhere in Helena, Commissioner Roy Aldous was starting his day. Not knowing what was coming. Not knowing that two people from a mountain he'd never visited were carrying 3 years of someone's careful criminal operation in a waterproof case in the back of a truck. Not knowing that one of them had grabbed a stack of files out of a burning building at 3 in the morning rather than let the evidence disappear. Not knowing any of it. Yet. Helena was gray and cold and busy in the way small capital cities are busy. Not frantic, not loud, just purposeful. People moving between buildings with their collars up carrying folders and briefcases, and the particular energy of people who work inside systems that other people depend on. Harlan pulled into the parking lot outside the Montana Land Office building. He reached into the back seat for the waterproof case. And stopped. A vehicle parked 4 spaces down that he recognized. Dark blue sedan. Clean. Montana plates. He'd seen it twice in Millhaven, once outside the recorder's office, once parked near the feed store the morning he'd confronted Greer. Wade Denny's car. His hand stayed on the case. They're already here. Of course they were. Delia appeared at his elbow. She'd seen it too. Denny's, she said quietly. Yes. So Greer beat us here? Yes. She looked at the car, then at the building, then at Harlan. Does that change what we do? Harlan picked up the case. No, he said, and walked toward the building. The receptionist sent them to room 14. Commissioner Roy Aldous stood up when they came in. Mid-60s, heavy through the shoulders, white hair cut short and practical. The face of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions that affected other people's land and had never stopped understanding the weight of that. He looked at Harlan, then at Delia, then back at Harlan. Cade, he said, it's been a long time. It has. They shook hands. Sit down, Aldous said. They sat. He sat. He folded his hands on the table, and he said something Harlan hadn't expected. Before you show me anything, Aldous said, I need to tell you something first. Harlan waited. I had a representative of Greer Land Holdings in this office yesterday afternoon. Aldous' voice was even, measured. And this morning I received a formal complaint filed through the county sheriff's office in your jurisdiction. He looked at Harlan directly. The complaint alleges that you have been falsifying survey documentation in order to fraudulently challenge a legitimate boundary correction filing, that the woman living on your property was a co-conspirator, and that any documentation you presented to my office would appear professional but would be manufactured. Silence. Harlan had thought he was ready for this. He'd run the scenario on the drive down. He was still cold when he heard it out loud. Delia said nothing beside him. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was completely still, the way a face gets when a person has heard so many lies told confidently in official rooms that another one barely registers as a surprise. She'd sat in rooms like this before, and heard things like this before, and been alone when she heard them. She wasn't alone now. Harlan opened the waterproof case. He set the documentation on the table. All of it, organized, dated, cross-referenced. The survey notes, the photographs and their descriptions, the annotated map, the timeline of the filing, the original registration from Delia's land with both her signature and her husband's, the letter. He set it all out carefully. Then he looked at Aldous. I'll let the file speak first, he said, and he was quiet. Aldous read for 26 minutes. Harlan counted, not impatiently, just because he needed something to do with his attention other than think about what happened if this didn't work. Delia sat without moving, without fidgeting, without looking at Harlan for reassurance. She'd done this before, sat in a chair while a man with authority read papers that determined what happened to her life. Last time it hadn't been enough. Last time the man behind the desk had said the papers looked legitimate, said she'd probably signed something she didn't remember, said these things happen when people are grieving. And she'd walked out alone with nothing. She understood something now that she hadn't fully understood then, The first time she'd been hoping. She'd walked into that office believing that truth was a thing that once presented clearly would be recognized and acted upon. She'd believed that a system existed to protect people like her and that the people who operated that system would use it correctly if she just showed them the right things. She'd been wrong, not about truth, about the system. The system was only as good as the people in it. And the people in it were capable of looking at truth and calling it something else when they had reason to. This time she was not hoping. She was calculating, watching Aldis's face as he turned the pages, watching his hands how they handled the documents, whether he was reading carefully or skimming, whether his expressions tracked with what he was reading. Doing what she'd always done in difficult situations, gathering information, staying ready to respond to whatever came next. But underneath the calculation, underneath the watching and the reading and the steady hands on the table, there was something else. Something that Delia Voss had not had the first time. Harlan Cade sitting 3 feet to her left. Not doing anything, not speaking, not offering reassurance she hadn't asked for, just present. Solid. The same way he'd been solid on the fence line, and solid in the cabin, and solid in the drive down the mountain, and solid through everything she'd watched him do and not do since November. A man who didn't move until he was sure, and then moved without hesitating. She didn't need rescuing. She'd never needed rescuing. What she'd needed, what she'd never had before, was someone with standing who was willing to stand next to her. That was different. That mattered. Aldis set the file down. "The original registration," he said to Delia. "Your husband's signature and yours. Is this authentic?" "Notarized at the time of purchase," Delia said. "I can give you the notary's name, the county office, the date. Your signature on the transfer document Greer filed is not mine. Flat. Certain. Like a stone set down. I refused every offer Greer made. My husband and I discussed him specifically. We knew what he was. Your husband's letter. Written in his own hand. I have other samples if you need comparison. Letters, survey notes from his work tax documents." Aldis looked at the survey documentation, the compass bearings, the annotated map. "You did this survey," he said to Delia. "I did. Your background." "My husband was a timber assessor for 11 years. I worked alongside him for most of that. I know how to read terrain and document what I find. And I know how to testify to my findings if it comes to that." Aldis looked at her steadily. Then he looked at Harlan. "The markers. You believe they were moved in coordination with the filing." "The timing is consistent," Harlan said. 60 to 90 days before the October filing. Moved precisely 18 inches each uniform in a pattern that benefits the boundary correction claim, not natural displacement. And Pruitt has had a relationship with Greer long enough that supporting his filings has become routine," Harlan said. "The pattern speaks for itself." Aldis was quiet. He looked at the window, at the gray sky above the buildings, a long quiet that had thinking in it rather than hesitation. Then he said, "Greer's representative told me yesterday that you'd been surveying your boundary in preparation for a fraudulent challenge. Describe the documentation you'd be bringing, in some detail." Harlan went still. "He described it," Harlan said carefully, "almost exactly as it appears, before I'd seen it." Delia turned slightly. Her eyes met Harlan's for just a moment. "Which means," she said, "he's seen real documentation like this before, from someone else who tried to fight him. He prepared his counter-argument in advance because he knew what legitimate evidence looks like, because he's faced it before and survived it." Aldis looked at her, a long look. The look of a man who had been doing a difficult job for a long time and had just had something confirmed that he'd been hoping wasn't true. "How many?" Harlan said. Aldis pressed his lips together. "That," he said quietly, "is what I need to find out." He stood up. "I need 40 minutes, he said. "Wait here." He took the file with him. The bench outside room 14 was wooden and not built for comfort. Harlan and Delia sat on it and did not talk about what was happening inside the room. She looked at the wall. He looked at the floor. The hallway was quiet except for distant phone conversations and the sound of a printer somewhere and the institutional hum of a building full of people doing paperwork that mattered more than it looked like it mattered. What if it's not enough? What if Aldous decides the safer move is to process the filing and let the courts sort it out over years, while Greer moves on to the next county and the next parcel and the next widow who has no one beside her? Stop. You've done what you can do. The file is the file. The evidence is the evidence. You can only give him what he needs to make the right choice. And then wait. Harlan was not comfortable with waiting. He was excellent at it, which was different. At the 38-minute mark, the door opened. Aldous came out with a second folder in his hand, thicker than the one Harlan had brought. He stood in the hallway for a moment looking at them. Something in his face had shifted, not dramatically, just settled, the way a face settles when a decision has been made and the deliberating is done. "Come back in," he said. He sat. They sat. He opened the second folder. "In the last 3 years," he said, "my office has processed 14 boundary correction filings in counties within Greer Land Holdings' operational range." He looked at the folder. "Of those 14, I had my assistant flag every one where the county sheriff had a documented relationship with Greer or his company, speaking engagements, campaign contributions, payments described as consulting fees." He looked up. 11 of the 14, he said. Nobody spoke. 8 of those 11 were approved, Aldous continued. In the 3 cases where they weren't, the applicants withdrew before final review. No challenge, no fight. They just stopped. He paused. "Now I'm wondering why." He closed the second folder. "Your filing was number 15, he said to Harlan. "It arrived 6 weeks ago. I hadn't approved it. There were questions about the survey methodology I'd flagged. Small questions, the kind a busy office might let slide." He paused. "Pruitt's supporting statement arrived this morning, which would have been sufficient to move it toward approval within the week." "But," Delia said, "but the supporting statement arrived the same morning that Greer's representative was sitting in that chair telling me in significant detail exactly what fraudulent documentation you were about to bring me." Aldous looked at the table. "And I have been doing this job for 19 years. And in 19 years I have learned one thing with absolute certainty." He looked at them both. "When someone calls ahead to warn me that incoming evidence is fraudulent," he said, "the evidence is almost never the thing to be suspicious of." Something released in Harlan's chest. Not relief, not yet. Something steadier. The particular feeling of a foundation holding when you weren't sure it would. "I'm opening a full investigation," Aldous said. "All 14 prior filings. Greer Land Holdings' complete operational history in Montana. Every county official with a documented relationship with the company." He folded his hands. "This will take time. Months." "And my filing," Harlan said, "suspended immediately. Today. The markers on my eastern ridge. I'm authorizing an independent survey team to re-establish the original boundary markers based on the 1987 documentation. Your property line will be secured within 2 weeks." He turned to Delia. "Mrs. Voss, your transfer document will be reviewed as part of the investigation. If the signature comparison confirms forgery, and based on what I'm looking at, I believe it will, the transfer will be voided. Your original registration becomes the controlling document. Your land comes back to you." Delia was very still. Not frozen, not overwhelmed. Still the way a person gets when something they've been carrying for a very long time becomes possible to put down. "How long?" she said. "Months," Aldous said honestly. "I won't give you a number I can't stand behind. But it will happen. I'll see to it personally." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. Quiet, exact. No performance in them. Just the simple weight of a person who meant what they said. They walked out into the gray Helena afternoon. Cold. Still. A few flakes of snow drifting sideways in the wind. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The parking lot spread out in front of them. Denny's blue sedan still parked 4 spaces down, an ordinary car carrying the weight of something that was about to come apart around it. It wasn't over. Harlan knew that. The investigation would take months. Greer was still free. Pruitt was still in his office. The land hadn't been returned yet. This was not the ending. This was the moment before the ending began. But the filing was suspended, and Aldous was looking at 14 prior filings with new eyes. And somewhere in a county office, someone was about to start pulling threads on a system that had been pulling threads on other people for years. That was real. My husband was right, Delia said. Harlan waited. He said in the letter men like Greer only survive because no one with enough standing decides to stop them, she said. He meant that I couldn't do it alone, that if something happened I'd need someone who could stand where the system would actually listen. A pause. He wasn't wrong. You had the evidence, Harlan said. I had the access, both were necessary. Yes. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. He prepared for something he hoped would never happen, she said, and when it did exactly what he'd prepared, was exactly what was needed. Harlan thought about that, about a man who had loved his wife enough to slip a document into the lining of her bag without telling her, who had made quiet preparations and then gotten sick and died before he could use them, who had trusted that she would find it, that she would know what to do with it. He'd trusted her, even from wherever people go when they leave. He sounds like a man worth knowing, Harlan said. He was, Delia said simply. They were walking toward the truck when the building door opened behind them. Aldous, moving fast, coat half on, one hand up. Cade. They stopped. He caught up, slightly out of breath, holding a sheet of paper, a printout ink still fresh. I had my assistant run a cross-reference, he said. The 14 prior filings, properties where the listed owner was deceased at the time of transfer. He held out the paper. Harlan took it, one entry highlighted in yellow. A parcel in a valley 40 miles west of Millhaven. Transfer filed 2 years ago. Owner listed as deceased, a man named Douglas Farrow, died 18 months before the filing date. No estate probated, no next of kin notified. The land passed to his surviving brother, Aldous said. Man named Ray Farrow, lives near Cutbank. Isolated, no legal representation. He has no idea his brother had this parcel or that it was transferred out of the family 2 years ago. Harlan looked at the address. Cutbank, 4 hours from Millhaven on winter roads. Your investigation will reach him, Harlan said. It will, Aldous said. In months, after the paperwork. But someone could reach him sooner. Someone who already understands what happened and can explain it in plain terms to a man who doesn't know what he doesn't know. He looked at them both, not asking directly, just holding the space for it. Harlan looked at Delia. She was looking at the address on the paper, not at him. Then she looked up. I know where Cutbank is, she said. Harlan folded the paper, put it in his coat pocket, looked at Aldous. We'll take care of it, he said. Aldous studied him for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man who believed what he was hearing. I know you will, he said, and walked back into the building. They drove back toward the mountain in the gray afternoon, snow coming in properly now, not flurries, real snow, the kind that settled and stayed. Harlan drove. Delia looked out the window at the mountains rising in the distance. After the first hour, she said, You didn't have to say we'd go to Cutbank. I know. Nobody asked you to. I know. Pause. Why did you? She said. He thought about it carefully, wanted to get it right. Because it's the next thing that needs doing, he said. And we know about it. And knowing about something and not acting when you can, that's a choice too. She was quiet. My husband used to say something like that, she said. Sounds like he was right about a lot of things. He had his moments. She looked out the window at the snow. After a while she said, He thought the evidence was what mattered. Destroy the evidence, destroy the case. He didn't understand that the documents were just the record of what we already knew. You can't burn what's already in someone's head. No, Harlan said. You can't. The mountains grew larger as they drove north. The road climbed. About an hour out from Millhaven, she said, The cabin, when things settle. I want to fix the roof properly before spring. I'll get materials, he said, and the crew to help. A roof is faster with 4 people than 1. She looked at him. And the new contract, he said. The survey work on the western boundary. Spring is the right time to start. 20 miles of fence line that hasn't been checked properly in 3 years. She almost smiled. Almost. You want to talk contracts right now? Is this the wrong time? You are, she said slowly, the most relentlessly practical man I have ever encountered in my entire life. Is that a problem? She looked out the window. No, she said quietly. It really isn't. They went to Cutbank 5 days later. Ray Farrow opened his door in work boots and a flannel shirt, and the careful expression of a man who lived alone and had learned not to trust unexpected visitors. He was in his early 70s, lean, weathered in the way outdoor people weather not harshly, but honestly. His eyes were sharp, the kind of eyes that had been paying attention for a long time. "Mr. Farrow," Harlan said, "my name is Harlan Cade. This is Delia Voss. There's something you need to know about your brother's land." Ray Farrow looked at Harlan, then at Delia, measuring. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. His kitchen was clean and sparse. A wood stove working hard against the cold. A table with 4 chairs, only one of which showed regular use. A shelf of books above the window spines cracked from reading. He made coffee without asking if they wanted any, set 3 cups down, sat. "Tell me," he said. So they did. Harlan laid out the filing, the transfer, the company, the timeline, the investigation now underway at the land office. Delia explained what the process would look like from here, what documents Ray would need, who to contact, what to say, and what not to say. She'd been through enough of this from the wrong side to know every step of the process from the inside out. She knew where it moved fast and where it stalled, which questions to ask, which assumptions to push back on. She talked for 20 minutes straight, which was, Harlan noted, more than he'd heard her say at one time since November. Ray Farrow listened without interrupting, asked 3 questions at the end, all of them precise, took notes in a small spiral notebook with a pencil he kept behind his ear. Then he sat back, looked at them both. "My brother bought that land 30 years ago, he said, saved for it, said he wanted something that was his, something that would be there after he was gone." He paused. "He left it to me because I was the only family he had left." Nobody spoke. "I didn't know about it," Ray said. "He didn't tell me. Maybe he thought he had more time to." He looked at his coffee. "He died fast, faster than anyone expected." "I'm sorry," Delia said. Ray nodded once. "Why'd you come yourselves?" he said. "You could have left it to the investigation." "Because it's your land," Harlan said, "and you had a right to know sooner." Ray looked at Delia. "You lost land too, got it taken the same way." "I did." "And you're getting it back." "I am," she said. "It takes time, but yes." He looked at his notebook, at his notes. "My brother would have liked you to," he said. "He believed people ought to look out for each other, said that was the point of being neighbors even when neighbors were a long way apart." He stood up, extended his hand to Harlan, then to Delia. "Thank you for coming all this way," he said. They drove back in the dark. 4 hours of mountain road with snow on both sides and the sky overhead clear and full of stars. Delia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "His brother saved for 30 years for that land." "Yes." "And it was just gone, without anyone telling him." "Yes." "That's what Greer does," she said. "He finds the gaps, the places where people don't know to look, where the connection between a person and what belongs to them is thin enough to slip something in between." She looked out at the dark. Widows, people who live alone, people whose paperwork is somewhere they don't think to check. "And years finding the right people inside the system to keep those gaps open," Harlan said. "There are people out there," she said, "who still don't know, who are going about their lives not realizing something that belongs to them was quietly taken. The investigation will reach them. Eventually." "Yes," he said. "Eventually." The road climbed into the mountains. The temperature dropped. The stars wheeled overhead. Harlan. "Yeah. What you did," she said. "Coming off the mountain, going to Kessler, confronting Greer, driving to Helena. None of that was your problem." He drove for a moment. "It became my problem when I knew about it," he said. She was quiet. "That's not how most people think," she said. "Maybe not. Most people think knowing about something and being responsible for it are separate things." "They're not," he said. She looked at him, at his profile in the dark, at the same stillness she'd seen the first morning she'd opened that cabin door and found him standing in the clearing, a man who didn't move until he was sure, and then moved without hesitating. "No," she said. "I don't suppose they are." The investigation took 4 months. Aldous called Harlan twice during that time. Once in January, with an update on the independent survey team, the markers on the eastern ridge re-established the 1987 boundary lines, restored the documentation filed with the land office. The Ponderosa stands secure. Once in February, with the handwriting analysis results. The signature on Delia's transfer document. The forensic examiner's report was 15 pages and concluded what Harlan had already known, what Delia had always known in the first paragraph. The signature was not hers. The letter formation was different. The pressure was different. The spacing was different. The forger had been skilled, but skilled wasn't the same as identical, and a skilled forensic examiner was skilled too. Greer was arrested on a Tuesday in February. A federal agent and 2 state investigators walked into his office in Billings and arrested him on 17 counts: fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit property theft across 6 counties. No sirens, no cameras, no drama. Just a man in a careful suit being walked out of a building in handcuffs on a Tuesday afternoon while the street went about its business. Harlan heard about it from Aldous the same day. Called Delia immediately. She was quiet on the phone for a moment. "Good," she said. "Just that. Good." And then, "How many did they get him on 17 counts, he said. Another pause. "He'll fight it," she said. "He will. He has lawyers." "So does the state," she said. "And now they have 63 pages of Wade Denny telling them everything." She was right. Pruitt resigned before the investigation formally recommended his prosecution, submitted his resignation to the county board on a Tuesday morning, and was gone by Wednesday. 11 years as sheriff. Gone in 48 hours. He left without a statement, without an explanation, without anything that looked like accountability, and everything that looked like a man trying to limit his exposure before the full weight of the thing came down on him. Harlan thought about Pruitt sometimes, late at night with the mountain quiet around him, not with anger, with something more complicated than anger, with the particular kind of sadness that comes from watching a man who was once decent choose one small accommodation at a time to become something less than that. The choice had been available every time. At every filing approved, every complaint accepted, every time he'd looked at Delia Voss across his desk and told her she must have signed something she'd forgotten. He could have stopped at any of those moments, could have looked at what he was doing and decided it wasn't who he wanted to be. He hadn't, and now it was decided for him. Wade Denny cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. The full operational structure of Greer Land Holdings laid out in 63 pages of testimony. Names, dates, methods. The system that had been running quietly through 6 counties for nearly 4 years. Of the 14 prior filings, 6 were voided outright. Land returned to original owners or to legal heirs. Ray Farrow's brother's parcel among them. Harlan heard about it from Aldous and called Delia, and she said good again in the same quiet tone, and he could hear in it the particular weight of someone who knew exactly what it meant for a person to get back something they didn't know had been taken. 3 more filings under continued review. 5 too legally complicated to reverse quickly, the chains of ownership too long, the third-party buyers too far removed from the original fraud. Those would take years. Some of them might never fully resolve. That was a hard thing. But the investigation was real. The work was being done. And that meant something. That meant things could change for people who 6 months ago had no reason to believe they would. Someone was doing the work. That mattered. Delia's letter came in March, a Tuesday morning. Cold, but with the first suggestion of spring, that particular smell of frozen ground beginning to soften that Harlan had learned to recognize as the mountain's way of announcing a change. She came to his cabin with the letter in her hand, knocked once and came in without waiting because he'd told her in December that she didn't have to wait. She set the letter on the table in front of him. He read it. Certification from the Montana Land Office. Transfer document officially voided. Original registration, the controlling document. Delia Marjorie Voss, the legal owner of her land, as of the date of original purchase. He set the letter down, looked at her. "Congratulations," he said. She folded it carefully, put it in her coat pocket. "I want to go see it," she said. "I'll get the truck," he said. "The road's still iced in places," he said. "I know." She looked at him. The old argument, the one that wasn't really an argument. "Fine," she said. But on the way back, I'm driving. You don't know the mountain roads. I'll learn them. He stood up, drained his coffee, picked up his keys. That's fair, he said. They drove out to her land on a morning in late March when the snow was thinning and the ground showed through in patches, brown and gray, and just at the edges the first suggestion of green. The road to her property was unpaved, running along the valley floor between two low ridge lines. Harlan had pulled the directions from the land office documentation. He'd driven roads like this 100 times. He navigated by terrain rather than by sign, which was useful because the signs out here were old, and some had fallen over and nobody had bothered to put them back up. The property came into view as they rounded the last curve, a valley opening up, broader than he'd expected from the map. Fence posts still standing along the eastern perimeter wire, long gone where Denny's men had torn it down. A house at the center, small, single-story white paint gone gray from 2 winters without anyone caring for it. Windows intact. A lean-to shed behind the house door open on its hinges. A kitchen garden to the south side, the beds still defined by their low timber borders, overgrown now but with the bones of a serious garden still visible. Someone had put real work into this place. Harlan stopped the truck. Delia didn't move for a moment. She was looking at all of it. Not just the house, the whole property, the valley, the ridge lines, the particular way the creek ran along the northern edge, and the way the cottonwoods had grown up around it in a line that followed the water with the kind of organic logic that took decades to develop. She was seeing it the way you see a place you haven't been for a long time, the double vision of memory and reality, the comparing of what was with what is the accounting for everything that has changed and everything that hasn't. Then she got out. He stayed in the truck, because this was hers, and some moments belonged to the person who earned them and nobody else. His presence was for the drive and the practical business of getting there. What happened in this valley on this morning between Delia Voss and the land that was now hers again, that was not for him. She walked to the house, tried the door, it opened. She went inside. He waited. From where he sat he could see the valley spreading out around the house, the fence posts standing at their intervals along the eastern boundary, the line of cottonwoods along the creek at the far northern edge, the kitchen garden with its overgrown beds and its timber borders still holding their shape, the lean-to shed with its open door swinging slightly in the wind, and the sky above it all, enormous, pale, full of the particular quality of light that comes in March in this kind of valley when winter is finishing but hasn't quite finished, a light that was both cool and bright, that cast long shadows and still managed to make everything it touched look clarified, particular, worth looking at. He understood suddenly why her husband had chosen this place. He'd spent 8 years on his own mountain, which had its own qualities of light, the way it came over the ridge in early morning, the way it moved through the timber, the long shadows of late afternoon across the open pasture. He understood light as a feature of land, as something you considered when you chose where to put a house, where to plant a garden, where to build the thing that was supposed to last. Her husband had seen this light, had understood what it meant to live in a valley that caught it this well, had saved for 30 years to stand in it every morning. Harlan sat in his truck and looked at the light on the valley and thought about a man he'd never met and would never meet, who had been careful enough to prepare for what he hoped would never happen, and whose preparations had reached through a waterproof case in the back of a truck and a signed contract in a worn notebook, and a woman who refused to be diminished by anything that had been done to her, all the way to a conference room in Helena, and a 19-year career official who'd been waiting for the right file to land on his desk. That was not nothing. After 15 minutes, she came back out. Her face was complicated the way a face gets when a place holds too many things at once. Every memory layered over every absence, layered over the particular complicated relief of having something returned that should never have been taken. She stood on the porch for a moment. Just stood there, looking at the valley the way her husband must have looked at it, the way you look at something you chose. Then she came down the porch steps toward the truck. "It's in good shape," she said. "Structurally. The roof on the north side needs work. Some window frames. The floor in the back room is soft, but it's the subfloor, not the joists. The bones are sound." "Spring is a good time to start on a roof," he said. She looked at him. "You're doing that thing again," she said. "What thing?" "Where you pivot immediately to the practical. Is that a problem?" She looked at the house, at the valley, at the light coming in at its particular angle over the cottonwoods. "My husband chose this place because of the light," she said. "Said it had more light than anywhere he'd ever been. He used to sit on that porch in the morning and just sit, not doing anything, just being in it." Harlan looked at the porch, at the light on it. "He was right about the light," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then he'd have liked you." Harlan considered that. "Seems like a man worth being liked by," he said. She turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That is," she said slowly, "the most human thing I have ever heard you say. I have my moments." She looked at him, at the house, back at him. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you what the roof needs. You can tell me what you disagree with." "I'll probably disagree with very little." "We'll see," she said, and they walked toward the house together. Not side by side exactly, more like in the same direction, at the same pace. Two people who had learned over the course of a long, hard winter that moving in the same direction at the same pace was something. Not nothing. Its own kind of thing with its own kind of weight. He drove back up the mountain that evening. Alone, same as always. As the same 40-minute drive up the same iced road past the same rock faces and spruce trees and frozen creek beds he'd been driving past for 8 years. The same dark coming down over the same ridge. The same stars beginning to appear in the east as the light died in the west. He'd driven this road in every kind of weather. In blizzards bad enough that he'd had to pull over and wait for visibility. In summer thunderstorms that turned the switchbacks into small rivers. In the clear, bitter cold of January when the road was a ribbon of ice and you drove by feeling the tires rather than by sight. He knew every curve of it, every place where it widened and every place where it narrowed to barely more than a single lane. Every landmark that told him how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. Tonight it felt different. Not the road. The road was exactly what it had always been. But something in his understanding of arriving at the top of it had changed without him choosing it to change. He pulled up to his cabin, engine off, sat in the quiet. The mountain was quiet in the way mountains are quiet in March, not the dead quiet of deep winter when everything stopped, but the quiet of a world beginning to wake up. He could hear water somewhere moving under ice, the creek probably starting to loosen. Somewhere in the spruce trees above the cabin something small moved in the dark, a branch settling or an animal shifting or just the wind finding a new path through the timber. His land was intact. The markers on the eastern ridge had been re-established by the independent survey team in January. Right where the 1987 survey had put them, not an inch off. The Ponderosa stand on the eastern slope still standing. 6 years of growth. Undisturbed. Worth more standing than cut, which was why he'd left it, and which was why he'd keep leaving it. Some things were better when you let them be. He went inside, made coffee, sat at the table where he'd written out a contract in a notebook on a cold November morning for a woman standing in the doorway of a broken cabin with an adze in her hand and no apology on her face. He looked at the table for a moment, just looked at it. The same table where he and Delia had spent 2 days building a file that had made it to Helena and had been enough. The same table where he'd spent late evenings with topographic maps and cold coffee working out what was happening to his eastern ridge. The same table where he'd eaten alone every morning for 8 years. It was just a table. Wood and joinery and use. Nothing dramatic about it. But things had happened at it that mattered. And he was aware of that in a way he hadn't been before. He thought about everything that had come from that contract. 14 cases under investigation. 6 parcels returned. Ray Farrow knowing what he owned. Greer in custody. Pruitt out of office. And somewhere in a valley with more light than most places a woman sleeping in her own house tonight for the first time in 14 months. Because she'd found a cabin, and he'd chosen to knock instead of assuming, and she'd opened the door without fear. And they'd both decided that a piece of paper with both their signatures on it was worth more than either of them walking away. None of it was dramatic. None of it had been. Just a series of small, correct decisions made in sequence by people who understood that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing were not separate acts. They were the same act. Harlan finished his coffee, washed the cup, put it on the rack, went to the window, looked out at his mountain in the full dark. At the eastern ridge where the Ponderosa stood tall and silent and undisturbed, at the 3,800 acres that had been his for 8 years and would be his for years more. He thought about what she'd said on the drive home from Cutbank. You can't burn what's already in someone's head. No, you couldn't. The documents mattered. The evidence mattered. The original registration with its notarized signatures. The letter from a man who had loved his wife enough to prepare for the worst without telling her. The survey notes and the compass bearings and the annotated maps that Delia had built in December on a ridge above the Cottonwood Draw while the temperature dropped and the sky went gray and the rest of the world stayed inside. All of it mattered. But what mattered more was the decision to act on what you knew. To not let knowing and doing stay separate. To look at a situation that was wrong and decide that your comfort with your own quiet life was not more important than doing the next right thing. Even when the next right thing was difficult, even when it would take months, even when someone burned your roof in the middle of the night and filed complaints against you and had a county sheriff in their pocket and a company structure designed by lawyers to survive challenge. You did the next right thing, and then the next one, all the way through. That was a choice. It looked simple from the outside. It never was. He went to bed, lay in the dark, listened to the wind move through the spruce trees on the ridge. The same sound he'd fallen asleep to for 8 years. Steady, patient, unchanged. His land, his quiet, still his. And now not just a place he lived. A place where something had happened. Something that had mattered beyond the boundaries of his fence line. Something that had reached a woman in a valley with good light and an old man in Cutbank who hadn't known what he owned and 14 cases in a land office in Helena and a 19-year career official who'd been waiting for the right file to land on his desk. All of it from a column of smoke above a cabin in November. All of it from choosing to knock. Harlan Cade closed his eyes and slept the way a man sleeps when he knows he did the right thing. Not because anyone told him so, not because the outcome was perfect, but because he'd looked at what he knew and acted on it and kept acting on it all the way through. For a man like Harlan Cade, that had always been enough.